Good morning. Hi, I'm Matt. I'm one of the leaders here at East Valley Bible Church, and we had a challenge last week of trying to do a 19-point sermon. And people said that it couldn't be done, and it was done. So I decided to up the ante, and we're going to try a 20-point sermon this week.
The absolute madman.
The power has gone to my head. So basically what we've been doing the last few months has been going through this series From Eternity into Eternity, and we started in Genesis at the very beginning of the Bible, started with God is enough, and then we've been building off of that towards eternity into the future, because we believe that God is eternal, and then we as people are going to exist eternally into the future as well. We're going to have an eternal destiny. And so the Bible teaches, here's the story of the little itty bitty space of what happened here on earth, and the Bible records some of that. And so we've been going through the Bible. And so today we're going to not look at last week. Last week was easy. It could have been a really easy sermon. You guys could have just cut me off right at the beginning and said, hey, all the kings are evil. They're all evil. We're just going to move on. But this week it's a little bit more challenging because we're going to look and rewind just a little bit into Israel's history, and we're going to look at the other side of the kingdom, because at this point in history, Israel as a nation has been divided, and there is a southern kingdom and there's a northern kingdom, and today we're going to look at the southern kingdom. So as we get going, I just have a few fast facts to kind of get engaged with what's going on here in the series. We're going to be looking at the 20 kings of Judah from 925 to 586 BC. So we're going to cover about 339 years of history in the Bible. Fast facts on this is, first of all, 8 of the kings of Judah, the nation of Judah, had some good traits. That's why we can't just say it's evil, just move on. Last week, all 19 of the kings were terrible kings. This week we've got some hope, some silver linings. Next, every king has their grandmother or mother's name listed. I love asking questions, and I know that you guys love answering questions, right?
Sure.
I get some that's okay. What's the significance, do you think, of a grandmother or a mother being listed? Because this wasn't true of the 19 kings of Israel. None of the family members were really referenced at all. Influence?
Solomon had a lot of wives, and so his heir, I would think it wouldn't matter like which wife that heir came through. But also I think that looking down the line, you have some type of significance with, Jesus, part of his kingship has to do with his genealogy as well.
Yeah.
So
you have the ability to track from family to family to family.
So you got a whole kind of like a whole Mary.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
That's kind of what I'm looking at.
Yeah. Anything else that you guys see as significant? I mean, this could really preach as a Mother's Day message, right? Like what Harold said, like all the influence of the moms. Like moms have a huge influence in their kids' lives. I want to open up to you guys, because when we look at these 20 kings, what we're going to see is there's going to be a lot of good kings, and then there's going to be a lot of bad things that happen. Like there's a lot of things that happen, but I think it's interesting that the moms, the grandmoms are all included in that.
Sometimes aren't they given their names just to say to have a significant meaning in relation to the child. Like you'll see that with certain individuals, like the man who helped Jesus carry his cross. His name meant something, and then his father's name meant something, and it all kind of connected to the fact that he helped Jesus carry the cross.
Yeah, and that could be. I didn't do any research on the moms. I'm sorry. I did do enough research to know that, that each one of them had the moms, and that would be an interesting study, because a lot of times in the Bible, names, even what Pastor Bradley went through, is Nahum meant something, and so there's significance to meaning of names. But
I wonder if it has to do with the fact that Mary's lineage was also traced back to this line, so that being that she was the only DNA component of Jesus' life, that it would be traced back that way, and so I don't know. I don't know if that has anything to do with it or not.
yeah, that's interesting. Like I said, I don't have a point to this. It's more just kind of thinking through this, and it's just an interesting fact that the moms and grandmas are included. Fast facts, another one is no king conspired and killed the previous king. And this is significant because if you remember, 19 kings happened before, and it was like every single time, hey, this person killed this person, and then they took over, and then this person took over. And so assassinations were commonplace in Israel. In Judah, we're going to see some assassinations, which is, yay, like mystery and like whatever. But none of them are like in the family. Like the families don't kill each other. Fast fact.
Low standards.
What's that? We love our families. All right, fast fact, the bond between Judah and Israel. As you see, the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah is seen, there's a bond there. Like you can see that they have a care for each other, that they've got family lineage, they've got connection. But at the same time, you see them slaughtering each other in war over and over and over again. So I think it's interesting, even in our nation, you see the divide, but you also see, hey, we're all stuck in this together, at least for now. And you see that in Israel too. So what we're going to do, like I said last week, if you guys want to like just say, we've got food at the end of this, so like let's move on. Like if you want to get out of here a little bit faster, just like kind of make some sign to me. But we're going to try to get through 20 kings, and then I've got 4 kind of conclusions as a result of what we're going to see in these 20 kings. So the first king that we see is Rehoboam. Rehoboam, if you remember, was the son of Solomon. Solomon was the son of David. And so as the unified nation went forward, you see Rehoboam come on the scene, and we affectionately called him an idiot. We called him really a thick-headed guy, because basically what he had the option of doing was, hey, just don't oppress your own people, give them a break, and you can kind of have a unified nation going forward. Rehoboam said, no, I don't want to do that. I want to have slaves. I want to oppress the people, and the nation winds up splitting as a result. He's the first king then of the southern kingdom of Judah. Once the civil war starts, he becomes the first king of the southern kingdom, and he is described as evil. It's interesting, though, because he is given an option of going and trying to take back the northern kingdom, and he is about to do so, and a prophet comes to him and says, hey, you should probably not do that. And so he's like, okay. And so he doesn't try to recapture the northern kingdom, but he's still considered evil. He starts all these sorts of prostitutions, of idolatry, and all sorts of things that are going on. He reigned 17 years. And then you see his son, which I color-coded these, so I've got black and red for evil. And then you're going to see some teal and white for good. And so we're going to see kind of the back and forth here. So Rehoboam is evil. You go to his son, Abijah or Abijam, and these are fun names to say, just kind of marbles in your mouth. But he is the son of Rehoboam. He reigns for 3 years, and he decides, hey, my dad didn't try to unify this nation, so I'm going to go ahead and try to unify the nation. And he goes and he attacks Israel. He kills 500,000 people in Israel to try to reunify the nation. That doesn't seem like a great solution to unity, but that's how he goes. And it results in Jeroboam's death. Jeroboam was the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel, and there's still no unity within the nation. I just want to read this in 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 3 through 5. It talks about Abijam, and it says that he walked in all the sins of his father before him, Rehoboam, and committed them. And he was not wholeheartedly devoted to the Lord his God as his ancestor David had been. That's key. David was like kind of this key block that all these kings kind of come back to. And in verse 4, it says, but for the sake of David, even though Abijam was awful, but for the sake of David, the Lord his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem by raising up his son after him and by preserving Jerusalem. For David did what was right in the Lord's sight, and he did not turn aside from anything he had commanded him all the days of his life, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. So what we see is that Abijam, he looks around and he says, hey, the things that we have in Judah are amazing. We've got the temple. We've got the capital city of Jerusalem still going for us. I think that we should be unified. He tries to do it. It doesn't work out. And then his son comes on the scene, Asa, and he was the first good king of the nation of Judah. Asa reigned for 41 years, and he describes his rule as being wholeheartedly devoted to God. And when he was wholeheartedly devoted to God, guess what there was in the nation? Peace. It's just like this refreshing, like, Like all of a sudden, like he's doing what's supposed to be done. He's a good leader, and there's peace. And then you see, hey, well, actually, this is working out okay by myself. I don't really need God. I don't need to do what God wants me to do. He becomes self-reliant, and all of a sudden, wars and disease just like start to pile on in his life. For instance, towards the end of Asa's life, he gets a foot illness, which I don't know what kind of foot illness it was, but it sounds pretty painful, and it wound up killing him. But at the point that he had this illness, he says, man, this really hurts. I wonder what I can do. For us and him, we'd say, hey, let's go to the doctor. And so he goes to the doctor, and it says in the Bible that he relied upon the doctors to heal him instead of relying on the Lord, which I think is a really like strange thing, because in our culture we're like, well, science, technology, like that's what we need. And we have awesome technology and awesome science. I'm not anti-science, but when we depend on other things outside of the Lord and we say, this is what I'm depending on, and we become self-reliant, or we become reliant on technology or on science, man, that gets our shift and our focus way off of where it needs to be. And when it's not on God, we can be as healthy as a horse. I don't know what that means, but healthy as we can be, but it still will not fix our soul. And God wanted to get his attention, and even in his sickness, he decided, I'm not going to rely on anybody but what I know and what I'm comfortable with. I think it's also interesting, one last thing about Asa, is that he was good, he was wholeheartedly on board with obeying God, but he left something called the high places. And high places are referred to over and over again, and they were these parts of the country where people would go and they would offer sacrifices. And so it was kind of like, God was good in the temple, we can go and worship him there, but we might want our little side religion thing over here, so we're gonna come over to these high places. So it's kind of like God's good, but I want this little thing over on this side. And Asa allowed them to be there. Next king, the fourth king, was Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat, man, there's so much that could be said about this guy. He was a good king. He reigned for 25 years, but he had friends in low places. Ahab and Ahaziah were the two kings that were on Israel's side at the point. And if you remember anything about Ahab, he was compared to no one, because he was such a bad king on Israel's side that he got the worst of the worst of the worst. And Jehoshaphat was like, well, we can be allied. We can be in an alliance together. We can be friends. And as a result of that, I mean, it just drove Jehoshaphat to do some terrible, terrible things. And so Jehoshaphat was good when he was around God and around godly people, but he was really influenced by Ahab, and he was influenced by this guy Ahaziah, because Ahaziah built some ships. We referenced this last week. He built some ships, and Jehoshaphat got on board with these ships, and the ships sank because Ahaziah was such an evil king. God just kind of sent a storm, and they sank to the bottom of the sea. And so when he prioritized God and he prioritized spiritual reform, there were positive things that were happening. But when he didn't, man, there's some bad things that happened. And chapter 20 of 2 Chronicles is an awesome read. It's about this battle that takes place, and Jehoshaphat is trying to decide if he's going to go out and fight, if he's going to trust God. And I would just encourage you to read it, because it's where we get a lot of our songs. The battle belongs to the Lord. The battle is fought by the Lord. Like, that's Jehoshaphat saying, God, I can't fight this battle. You got to fight it for me. So his son, Jehoshaphat's son, was Jehoram or Joram. He was evil, and he reigned for 12 years and 8 years solo, because Jehoshaphat went out and he fought with Ahab, and when he fought with Ahab and aligned himself with Ahab, he's like, well, what if I die in battle? So I'm going to put my son as king. And so he started reigning 12 years before, 4 years with his dad. They were kind of co-ruling, and then 8 years solo. And then he married Athaliah, who was the daughter of, who do you think? Ahab. Dun, dun, dun. So Ahab, one of the worst kings possible in Israel's history, aligned himself with Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat was like, well, we can make this a unified thing by my son marrying your daughter. And so they aligned themselves in that way, and we will get to her in just a minute. But as a result, he decides, hey, I'm going to kill all 6 of my brothers, make sure that they don't try to assassinate me. I better kill them first. And he dies to no one's regret. That was like a quote from the Bible. That's not me. He died to no one's regret, which is funny, because a couple kings earlier, Asa, he prepared his own funeral, and like everybody celebrated when he died, because they were like, this was such a good king. Nobody cared that Joram died. Next king, Ahaziah. or any of those other names. If you're reading through the Bible as they're translated, they can translate a little bit different each time. And he was evil, but he was compared to Ahab on the other side of the map, that he was just as bad as Ahab. He was 22 years old and he reigned for 1 year. He aligned himself with Joram, king of Israel, again, kind of this togetherness. But he is assassinated by Jehu. And Jehu was a king of Israel, if you remember this from last week. Jehu assassinates, he's one of these guys that comes in and assassinates the previous king. But Ahaziah happens to be with this other king, Joram, and he just winds up dying as a result. So Jehu's like, I'm going to assassinate you. Oh wait, you're here too. I'm going to assassinate you too. And so he dies. And so guess who inherits the throne? We have to go back in the generations just a little bit, back to the first queen, the only queen of Israel or Judah, and that is Athaliah. Ahab's daughter, Athaliah, inherits the throne because both of her sons wind up dying. She kills her entire family. Yeah. Kills the entire family as a result, and trying to conquer and make sure that she becomes the queen master of the nation. She misses one child, and this one child is 1 year old, and actually Athaliah's daughter winds up hiding this 1-year-old baby and saying, okay, I'm not going to let this baby die, and so she takes him away. But she reigns for 6 years. And then it's Joash. Joash is the 1-year-old who is saved as a baby, and this guy is an awesome story. You should read it. Jehoiada conspires against the queen and anoints Joash at the age of about 7. And so at the age of 7, he becomes king. Jehoiada gets all the priests of the nation together, kind of attacks the city of Jerusalem, and Athaliah comes out of the temple, like, what's going on? She sees all these people, and she shouts, treason! Which is ironic because she just killed her entire family in order to become queen. But Joash becomes king after Athaliah is killed by these priests, which is an interesting turn. You've got priests killing people. And Joash, as you see in his life, he is a yes king. He's not a yes man, he is a yes king. Jehoiada lives for 130 years, and in his life, he leads Joash to do really good things, reform the nation, get back on track. He dies at 130, and immediately what you see in the next part of the story is that a bunch of advisors come in and say, you should do this instead. It's the opposite of everything Jehoiada had done for him. And he's like, you're right. I'm going to do what you say instead. And he just goes along with the next group of people, and he says yes to them. And the nation goes from being very good to Joash stoning and killing Jehoiada's son. This guy that appointed you as king, you're going to go ahead and do that like him. And man, it was a rough thing. And then he also decides, I'm going to take a bunch of the gold that's from the temple, and I'm going to pay off the king of Aram, who is coming and attacking me. Instead of trying to fight him off, I'm going to just bribe him. And so that's kind of Joash's life in a nutshell. You guys good? Do you have any questions so far? I know this is kind of just like bulldozing, but there's a lot there. Amaziah. We're good?
No, what number king are we on?
Are we counting? That was number 8. Amaziah, number 9. He reigned for 29 years, and he started when he was 25 years old. And Amaziah, I don't know exactly why he does this. He kind of wins a battle, and he becomes proud. And so he goes up to Israel, and he starts to poke them. And he's like, you guys aren't anything. You guys are worthless. You guys aren't doing what we're doing. And Israel's like, back off, dude. And he's like, no, I don't like you guys. And so he starts to attack Israel, and Israel responds and just slaughters them. Like, he slaughters the kings and the people of Judah and the army of Judah. And Israel winds up breaking down the wall. Like, they just attack Judah. They wind up going into the temple, taking a bunch of the treasure that's coming from the temple. And at the end of this, no kidding, the people of Judah aren't happy, and so they conspire against them, and they assassinate King Amaziah. And then you get the next king, and this is still in the same family line, same family tree, Uzziah or Azariah, and he was a good king. I had heard him described as a Uzi. If you think of the Uzi gun, it's a mini machine gun that is like a quick burst type of a shot. And Uzi And Uzziah sounds similar, but it's also similar to how Uzziah's life went. He had a short burst of being really, really on track with what God wanted him to do, and then at the very end of his life, it just died out. King at 16, he reigned for 52 years. He followed the Lord, is what it describes him as 2 Kings 15. But he had a brilliant mind. He was a brilliant farmer, which is an interesting thought, but he was also brilliant in the sense that he invented a lot of warfare items, and he was able to build up a really big army, and he was able to basically conquer everybody around him. But arrogance led to his fall and eventually his demise. If you read Isaiah chapter 6, and it talks about the throne room of God, the very first verse in Isaiah 6 says, in the year that King Uzziah died. So Isaiah, the book of Isaiah and Uzziah are kind of corresponding. The next king was also described as being good, and that was Jotham. He was 25 when he became king, and he reigned for 16 years, followed his dad's footsteps. He did things that were the way that they should have been done. But again, like, it's just an interesting parenthesis that the people still had their high places. There was still the little idolatry, the little worship that was going on. The people's hearts, really what it's saying, the people's hearts of the nation weren't in line with what the king was trying to do. They still wanted to do whatever they wanted to do. I should have started with this question. Do you guys like history?
Yeah.
I mean, it's too late now, but we're knee deep in this. Okay, Ahaz, number 12. Ahaz was 20 when he became king. He ruled 16 years. He followed Israel's example again as being evil. He lost a battle to Israel, Aram, Philistines, Edom, and the nation just starts to like crumble. Like the cities are lost, the temple, like everything is just kind of falling in around them. And so he goes to the king, and this is kind of a new king, up and coming, Tiglath-Pileser III. He goes to Syria and he bribes them with a bunch of money from the temple again, because this temple is, what did we say? It was like $40 billion worth of gold and silver and all this stuff. So they're just stripping stuff off the walls. Like they're just giving stuff to people and say, protect us, please. And so Ahaz winds up going to Assyria to protect the nation of Judah. After his death, you see the next king, which is a good king, and that's Hezekiah. Hezekiah at 25 reigned for 29 years. And Israel, I mean, in this time frame of Hezekiah, you see him battle and stand up to Assyria, and then you see him cower to Assyria, and then you see him stand up to Assyria, and there's this back and forth going on there. But at the end of it, what you see is that Hezekiah trusts the Lord, and they break free from Assyria, and they're no longer a vassal, they're no longer paying tribute to Assyria. They are again, a unified nation. We're going to come back to Hezekiah in just a little bit. But Manasseh is the next king, and it's all black because it's all evil. Again, dun dun dun. King at 12 years old, and he reigns for 55 years. That's a long time for somebody to rule. He did a huge amount of evil. That's the translation of the Bible, that it's a huge amount of evil, and God sentences judgment. This is the first time that a king all of a sudden has a judgment pronounced on them, that this is what is going to happen. God is going to judge you as a result of your sin. And it was not an optional thing. It was not a, hey, maybe we'll think about this or talk about this later. It was, this is coming. This is going to happen. The next king was evil, not quite as evil as Manasseh, but he was basically just like his dad. His servants wind up looking at him and saying, I don't like you very much, and so I'm going to conspire and assassinate you. And so we go on to the next king, and at this point, they've killed him so quickly that the next king is so young that he winds up being anointed as king at 8 years old, and that's the king Josiah. And maybe you've heard of Josiah, but he is unique. He's considered a unique king to everybody else. Like everybody else is considered, hey, they're good, they're bad, they're good, they're bad. But unique in the sense that what Josiah did, and if you read through his story, he did so many things to change the nation and lead them back towards the way that God wanted them to do and to live their lives, that everybody else kind of just stood back and was like, wow, this kid, this young person is doing an amazing job. And yet, we're going to get into this in just a minute, yet the judgment is still coming. 2 Kings 23, 4 through 14, and verse 24 describe all the things that Josiah did. And it's just, again, it's remarkable, all the things that he stripped away and said, hey, as a nation, we're not going to follow these gods, we're not going to serve them. And then he started promoting these things that were honoring to God. but then he winds up being killed in battle with Egypt, and then we go on to the next king, which is Jehoahaz, and he is considered evil. Josiah is the last good king, so if you've got any hope for the nation, it has been squashed at this point. And he's king at 23, and he reigns for 3 months. It's not a very long term. Yeah, go ahead.
So when you're saying that they reigned and they're dead, is that what we're saying?
They're dead. Yeah.
So not too many of them live very long.
Not too many. Manasseh, 55 years, so he was probably in his 60s or early 70s, so he was a little bit older. But, I mean, even Josiah, yeah, if you go back one, Josiah died at 39, so, yeah. Yeah, so Jehoahaz is the next guy. He's king of 23, reigned 3 months. He did evil. And King Necho, after he kills Josiah, this guy kind of gets promoted and he becomes king. King Necho's like, no, I don't really want you king. I just defeated you. And so he takes him out. I don't know if he is assassinated. I'm assuming that he was. But then he puts in and he installs the king that he wants, which is Jehoiakim. Again, depending on your translation of that, it might be Eliakim. And he becomes king at 25 and he reigns for 11 years. At this time, there's a new superpower, a new world power on the scene, and that's the called Babylon, or the Chaldeans in your Bible. And Babylon becomes a world power, and 3 years later, as Jehoiakim is serving Egypt, because that's who had conquered them, Babylon comes in, takes out Egypt, and as a result, Babylon now kind of controls Judah. And Judah is like, I don't really like this, so I'm going to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar, I'm going to rebel against Babylon. And so Babylon invades, and this key date, if you want to write this in your Bible, if you want to write this somewhere, this is important because we're going to come back to this, is 607 BC. Babylon comes, invades, and conquers Judah. And Babylon takes people and treasure captive. And I just want to check my notes really quick because there's a key person that is taken away in this invasion. I just want to confirm this includes Daniel. So if you get the book of Daniel out and you say Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel, at 607 BC, that's when they're taken captive, and Babylon goes along with all the gold, silver, and precious metals, and precious people. Then you get the next king. We're getting close. I think this is 19. Jehoiachin, who is evil. He becomes king at 18. He reigns 3 months, 10 days. And Nebuchadnezzar doesn't like what he's doing because he rebels against Nebuchadnezzar as well and rebels against Babylon. And so in 598 or 597, depending on our calendars compared to Jewish calendars, BC, Nebuchadnezzar comes in. He actually comes in person to this little battle that's happening in Judah, and he just squashes it and says, no, we're not going to do this. He takes people, takes Jehoiachin captive, takes him back to Babylon and says, you're not going to be king anymore. I'm going to appoint somebody as king. And so he appoints Jehoiachin's uncle, and his name is Zedekiah. Zedekiah is the last king in Judah's history, and we can all kind of take a deep breath and be like, okay, we're almost done. King at 21, he reigns for 11 years. He battles the prophet Jeremiah, and by battling, I mean he just takes the prophet Jeremiah, throws him in prison when Jeremiah says something he doesn't like. Jeremiah says this. He's like, no, I hate you, Jeremiah, get out of my presence. And there's just this battle that goes on throughout, to the point where as he is rebelling in the 9th year of his reign against Babylon, Jeremiah comes and says, look at this. Your nation is crumbling. This isn't going well for you. You can't go get help from Egypt. You can't go get help from anybody else. You just got to surrender. And Zedekiah is like, no way. I'm not surrendering. And Jeremiah's like, look, as long as you keep this fight up, people are going to continue to die. If you surrender, everybody's going to live. And Zedekiah, in this stubborn way, says, no, I'm going to keep fighting. And people continue to die. People continue to die of starvation. People continue to die in the war. And finally, Nebuchadnezzar just raises the place. He says, this isn't going to happen again. This is the third rebellion that's happened. I'm not taking this anymore. And so in 586 BC, he comes in, he breaks down the entire wall of Jerusalem, mounts up to the Temple Mount, and that beautiful presence that we looked at a few weeks ago with the temple that was beautiful is just caught on fire, burns everything, and burns it to the ground so that there's nothing left. Takes everybody but the very, very poorest of people and says, you're going to live somewhere else. You're not living here anymore. and he leaves Judah in ruins. And for the next 70 years, nobody and nothing happens in Judah. And we're going to pick that up next week. But in a word, now that I've said a lot of words, in a word, how would you describe Judah's last 339 years?
That was a mixed bag.
That was a mixed bag. I loved your face. I mean, it like was this. This is ugly. Do you have words behind it?
Boy, it was pretty evil.
Yeah, I would echo that. Rocky, contentious. Wish I had a white
Compromise.
compromise.
You kept seeing the thing with the high places,
Yeah,
and on one hand you could say, oh, it's just the people doing their thing, but on one hand, on the other hand, I think a lot of times politicians, even kings in that particular sense, will compromise in order to try to maintain power because it's politically expedient.
Mhm.
So it's like, oh, hey, cool, we're supposed to be a theocracy, but you go do your pagan thing.
yeah. It's a lot easier to just look
Yeah.
over here instead of pay attention to the fly on the
Israel
wall.
always had, or Judah, whichever,
Yeah,
always had some kind of idol worship. It was at least 70 years that they were in. When they come back from Babylon, they no longer had that idol worship mentality.
yeah. And I don't know if this is going to be brought up next week because next week is so far away. But like, that's a really like fascinating thing to look at. Is you look at all the way back to Mount Sinai when they're given the Ten Commandments. They make this golden calf, and so for thousands of years they're going back to idolatry. And then all of a sudden God says, "No, that's not going to be your way anymore." And it breaks here. Babylon breaks the idolatry of Israel, and Israel has never gone back to idolatry in the sense that they've got these other religions that they have. We've got Judaism today, and idolatry is not a thing anymore.
I see that applicable in my life, that God deals with me until I get rid of that.
Yeah, roots it
One
out.
other thing, yeah, he uses his own methods to root that out.
Yeah,
Weren't they too afraid, like even after Babylon and they came back, and by the time Jesus came, they were adding to the law? Because they wanted to be so, like, they were afraid they were going to break the law. They just kept adding more
yeah,
rules and regulations and
yeah.
not to what Jesus, the Old Testament. Yeah,
Yeah. I was like, we're back, we don't want that
Yeah.
happening.
Yep.
They got enough paganism in Babylon and they went, no more.
Yeah, yeah. So I look at that and I say, okay, you guys have given me words, and I could easily jot them up here and like stick them up here, and we got the big word. But I'm going to do something controversial, and the big word that I have for today is unchanging. And what I mean by that is opposite of everything we just saw, right? Like you see the kings, and you've got really good kings, you've got really bad kings, you've got some mediocre kings, you've got really good things happening, you've got bad things, you've got attacks, you've got death, you've got life, you've got all these different polar opposites, which wouldn't be unchanging whatsoever, but for one faithful thing, and that one faithful thing is God himself. That God was unchanging despite all the things that Judah did in going up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. And so I want to prove this to you, because you might be looking at me and say, no way, that last 339 years was not unchanging. It was anything but. But I want to prove this because God is unchanging, and I think in 4 ways. God is unchanging in his promises. God is unchanging in his promises. Roller coaster rides, we did a series a while back with Pastor Bradley where we got to kind of experience the ride of a roller coaster. And if you've been on that ride of a roller coaster, it's a lot of fun because you know almost without a doubt that you're not going to die at the end of it. Like you know that despite everything that's happening around you, you will be able to walk away and say, that was fun. If we had a 50% survival rate on roller coasters, I don't think we'd do it very often. Like it wouldn't be something that many people would try. But what we see in the last 39 years was a roller coaster ride of ups and downs, and the only sure thing that we saw throughout it was God's promises. God was faithful. And we see that in God's promises to David. I want you to open your Bible if you've got it, back to 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 16. And what we see before this chaos, before this crazy, before all these kings flowed in, what we see is God makes a promise to David. And here's the promise that he makes. He says, your house and kingdom will endure before me forever. and your throne will be established forever. There's a promise that there is going to be a king on the throne, that there is going to be a lineage, that there's going to be a kingdom, and that is a for sure thing. And despite all the things that are going around them, and that's before Solomon's sin of having 700 wives and worshiping at different places. It was before the Civil War took place. It was before these 20 kings came in and took office. The kings are always in reference back to David. David is always being kind of as a reference point to these people. If you look at 1 Kings chapter 15, what we read before in verse 3 through 5, was that David was the starting point. That, yeah, God could have done this, but he promised David something, so he's not going to. In 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 11, with another king, he makes the same reference point, and he says, but for the sake of my servant David, I'm going to keep you, and I'm going to remain faithful to you. In verse 11, I want to read that for you. It says, Asa did what was right in the Lord's sight, as his ancestor David had done. David is always at the key thought of this, and it's not because David is so great, but it's because God is remembering and referencing back to, I made a promise with David. I'm not going to forget that promise based on what's happening right now. I'm not going to change my promise based on circumstance, based on environment, based on how I feel, based on how you feel. My promise to you is a sure thing. He never switched who received the promise. You see throughout that lineage that it's one family. It's son after son after son, and then there's a daughter or queen thrown in there, and then there's another son. But it's one family tree. He never changes who the promise is to. He never changes the conditions of the promise based on who was in office. And he never forgot the terms of the promise. Even in judgment, even when Babylon comes in and wipes the people out, here's what Jeremiah the prophet says in chapter 29, verse 10. He says, for this is what the Lord says, when 70 years for Babylon are complete, I will attend to you and I will confirm my promise concerning you to restore you to this place. Even in the punishment, even in the judgment, even in the displacement, God is saying, I will keep my promise. The kings are preserved because of the promise to David, and the kingdom didn't survive because all the links were strong. You think about that, you are the weakest link, goodbye, and it kind of breaks there. That's not the way that God's promise works. It was not reliant upon the links of the chain. It was based upon the promise that he made to one individual person. And that was a sure thing. It was unchanging in his promise. The second thing that we see about God in his unchangingness is he is unchanging in his grace. He is unchanging in his grace. What is grace?
God's good.
God's goodness. Okay.
Undeserved merit.
Undeserved merit.
Earned favor and kindness.
Yeah.
Yeah. How would you take those definitions and then kind of like expand and say, this is what grace is? Not the definition, but this is what it is.
Free. What do you say?
Yeah.
I'm not searching for too much. I'm searching for the heart behind the definition. Like how does that
Love.
feel? How does that?
Generosity?
Yeah, it's given free.
Okay.
God's choice.
I think a lot of us know the definition, and a lot of us have experienced grace. I'm just trying to link the definition up with the experience. Like, how does that really like make sense? If it's free, if it's out of His love, like what does that look like? If you've ever given grace to somebody else, if you've ever loved somebody else, what does that
Letting them
mean?
slide for things they've done.
Okay.
I mean, during whatever period of time it may be, or for that moment.
Okay. Not like you did this, like pound it.
Right.
You know, like there's some patience there.
Yes.
Is it like praying for your enemies, like blessing over your enemies
Okay.
when
So,
they sin against you?
Like giving a Christmas gift to the person at work that tries to stab you in the back.
yeah. Yeah, that there's a genuine like care for somebody. Yeah, for sure. And I look at that and I say, how did God show His grace? And we could go through almost every single one of those 20 kings, the good and the bad, and somehow God displayed His grace. And we're not going to go through all of this because we're running out of time. You think about Jehoshaphat as a king. If I were to describe his personality, he was loyal, but to a fault. Like he was loyal to God and he did everything God wanted him to do. But then he was loyal to Ahab and everything Ahab wanted to do. and then he was loyal to God, and then he was loyal to this guy. And I think we know people like this. Like, these people are just, they'll follow this person no matter what. And that's great until you follow the wrong person or follow the wrong thing. And God, in his grace, said, hey, I'm going to show you grace, Jehoshaphat, despite your flaw. Yeah, it's a good characteristic. It's a strong thing to be loyal. But you've gone too far with this. And he was gracious even with him. You think about Uzziah, and I think the characteristic of Uzziah was that he was intelligent, but he was arrogant. I mean, he was so smart. Like, he was smart in the farmland, he was smart in the technology, he was smart in the science. Like, he was a really smart guy, but he became really arrogant to the point where he said, hey, I'm going to go into the temple, I'm going to sacrifice to God, and I'm going to do it my way. And God struck him with leprosy, struck him with a disease, and he wound up having to live isolated for the rest of his life. But I look at that, and even in God judging someone, he was gracious with Uzziah. He blessed that nation. When the people saw that he had died, people were mourning over him because of all the blessing that he had towards other people. And so even in his intelligence, he was arrogant, but God showed his grace to him. And then he showed grace towards Hezekiah. He was the hard worker, but anxious warrior. I can relate to this guy. He wants to see these things done, but he sees all the things that are mounting. He sees like all the things that are happening, and he sees Assyria coming, and he's like, well, what are we going to do about them? He sees this nation attack. What are we going to do about them? And I'm going to do this and this and this and this and this. But it's really out of my control. And God showed grace. He showed loving kindness. He showed goodness, even to Hezekiah. And then the last thing, or the third thing about God's unchanging character is that he is unchanging in his standard. If you look at 2 Kings 21, 2 through 9. And what we see there is God being unchanging in his standard. There's a guy that we didn't really get into, and we won't get into him too much, but Manasseh was the evil king. And in those 7 verses or so, it displays all the things that he did. He sacrificed his kids in the fire. He went and sacrificed to these fake gods over here. He started prostitution over here. He started slavery over here. Like, he did all the worst things that you could possibly imagine. To the point where God says, this is enough. And in 2 Chronicles 33, verse 11, what it says is that it says God took him. They captured Manasseh with hooks. They put a ring in his nose like a bull or a cow, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon for 2 years. He finally gets his head on straight, and he says, when he was in distress, he sought the favor of the Lord his God, earnestly humbled himself before the God of his ancestors. He prayed to him, and the Lord was receptive to his prayer. Receptive to his prayer. He granted his request and brought him back to Jerusalem, to his kingdom. So Manasseh came to know the Lord his God. That doesn't even seem fair, right? Like, Manasseh was such an evil that, like, just chop off his head, like, be done with him, like, move on. And yet he humbled himself, and God saw that. And even in that grace, that's an amazing picture of grace, but even in that grace, God says, I have a standard, Manasseh. I'll show you grace, but there is judgment that is going to come as a result of you doing these things. I can't look the other way. I'm going to be patient, but I can't look the other way. And so God's standard that he laid down in Exodus and the law all the way through was the same standard. God's standard remained the same. And that takes us to the last thing that I see in these kings, and that's unchanging justice. Unchanging justice. Josiah was an awesome king. You see all the reforms that he made. And then in 2 Kings 23:25, it says, before him there was no king like him who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his strength, according to all the law of Moses, and no one like him arose after him. Josiah did awesome stuff. And here's what God said. In spite of all that, the Lord did not turn from the fury of his intense burning anger, which burned against Judah because of all the affronts with which Manasseh had angered him. Despite what Josiah was trying to do, there was still judgment coming. Last verse in verse 27. For the Lord had said, I will also remove Judah from my presence, just as I have removed Israel. I will reject the city Jerusalem that I have chosen, and the temple above which I said, my name will be there. God's judgment was coming. God had a standard, and it was broken, and so God had to judge sin. And I look at that, and God is unchanging in his promises, his grace, his standard, and his judgment. And despite the roller coaster ride of Israel and Judah going on, God remained unchanging. changing. And here's how I just want to end this with an application for you and for me. One for personal health and one for on mission as a church. For personal health, here's what I would encourage you to do. Deal with sin now. If you don't know what sin is, what is that conviction that's in your heart that you say, man, I'm struggling with this. I know I probably should do this, but I really enjoy this. That's probably sin. If you want a clearer definition, you can talk to somebody, or you can just start reading the Bible, because the Bible is pretty clear. Here's what sin is, and here's what sin is not. But here's the encouragement. Here's the challenge to you. Is the thing that you're dealing with, whether it's behind closed doors or out in front of everybody, you need to deal with it. You see these kings, and basically what happened is, whether it was a high place kind of off to the side, or whether it was this blatant sin, there was death, there was destruction, there was separation, there was a devastation in relationships, there was brokenness, because sin was not dealt with. And as a people and as a church, we have to be so in tune with the fact that we need to confess our sins. Oftentimes we come and we worship, we celebrate, we sing the songs, we learn, we've got information, and we never get down to the point of, man, what I'm doing here is a sin, and I have to confess that to God, and I have to get forgiveness for it. I mean, that's where we all came from, right? Like, that's how we became Christians, is we admitted and we said, hey, I'm a sinner, God is perfect, I need Jesus, and so I need to trust him, and I need to really receive that forgiveness from him. That's where we are still today. That as his children, as we've been adopted into the family, now we need to continue to have that relationship. We don't just say, hey, Dad, I'm never going to see you again. No, we say, hey, I'm going to confess my sin. We've got to deal with our sin now and continuously. The last thing is on mission, and that is speak highly of God. Speak highly of God. He is unchanging. We see this world and we say, I mean, I don't know about you, but like the first conversations that I have with people most of the time are like COVID, politics, sports maybe. Like there's these conversations that here's where we go. My encouragement to you is how do you filter that conversation back towards, I have an unchanging God in the midst of this. I have an unchanging God who is showing me grace, who has a standard, who is going to judge sin, which is a really scary thought, but I need to have that conversation with some of my friends and family. That I've got to be able to talk highly of God and realize that God's not just a figment of their imagination. He's not just a conceptual thing that has been over the ages made up or just kind of a lie that's been promoted. But that this relationship that I have with God is someone that I'm going to talk highly of in the conversation with the people around me. Because at the end of the day, if we're going to be a church for the unchurched, it's not going to be effective for us to just kind of huddle up and say, hey, let's talk about God really quick. No, it's going to be, hey, I have this relationship and this is overflowing and I'm going to talk to people about it. And I'm going to have a relationship with them outside of